All right, so today we're going to be talking about chapter 10, and we're going to be talking about working with files. And here are all of the topics that we're going to cover today. Let's see. All right, so just a little introduction to files, why we care about them, why we would use them. Whenever you're working with data, with some sort of data, that's going to come from a file, usually. And then all of the things that you're going to do to that data is going to be stored somewhere else in a different file. So basically, think of all of your code that you're going to be writing is going to be stored in a file somewhere on a disk, somewhere on your computer, in the cloud, doesn't really matter. But the first step to save your program is going to be to save it in a file. So today we're going to be talking about how to store data into a file, how to retrieve data from a file, and a couple of other things. So as I said before, your files, they're going to interact directly with your code, with whatever you're doing. So you've probably seen, obviously you've seen a bunch of files in your life, but here are a couple of applications that use different types of files, such as your word processor, so your Notepad, Notepad++, image editors such as Photoshop, Adobe, doesn't really matter, spreadsheets, Excel, the most popular one, then any games, all of the games that you have on your computer or your children have on their computers, those all store your progress, their progress in data, in files. And web browsers, obviously, all of the web browsers, your information is probably stored somewhere on a separate file in the cloud of those websites that you visit. Now, to interact with the file, you have to do 3 steps. And these 3 steps are default for any work with files that you're going to be performing. The first one is you will have to open the file, because how will your program know that you want to be working with this file? So you have to specify that you want to open a file. Then you have to do something with the file. It doesn't really matter, either write data to your output file or read some data from your input file. It doesn't really matter. You have to do something with that file. And after that, you're going to close the file. And this one is the most important step in working with files. You always have to close the file, because this will cause a lot of problems for your program when it's running. It is also a security issue. If that happens, it can leave a lot of loopholes to get the data from that file. So always close the file if you open it. Now, there are 2 different types of files. Just in general, there are 2 different types. The first one is the text file. The text file contains literally any data that has been encoded. So any data that has been processed by either ASCII or Unicode. And let's recall the first chapter, ASCII and Unicode are just the way that we encode data as text. So we know that the computers use binary system and use zeros and ones. This is the way for us to actually turn those zeros and ones into letters and numbers. So if you see letters and numbers, that is a text file. If you see zeros and ones, that is a binary file. That is the second type. Binary file will contain any data that has not been converted to text. Let's see. There are also 2 methods to access your file. So the first one is a sequential access, and the second one is a direct access. And the difference between those is pretty simple. So with the sequential access file, you will access all of the contents of the file from the very beginning to the very end. You will not skip any parts. You cannot just pick one element. You have to go through the very beginning of your file all the way up to the end of your file and process all of the elements that are inside of that file. However, there's also direct access, and it's just in the name, direct, which stands for you accessing directly exactly what you want from that file. So you can pick just any piece of data, any element that exists in that file, you can pick it directly. That is where the direct access name comes from. However, in this chapter, we're going to be talking about the sequential access, but just so you're aware, there are 2 different methods for accessing information inside of your file. Now, creating a file and writing data to it specifically. Now, all of the files, they have their own extension, right? In this case, DAT stands for just general data. However, you probably saw a bunch of other different file extensions, such as JPEG, which stands for pictures, or MP3, that's an old one. MP3 stands for any audio. Then there's also TXT, which stands for text. So there's a bunch of other extensions. So those extensions just specify what type of data is inside of that file. Now, so you have to create either create a name for your file, or if that file already exists, that name will be created already for you. Now, after that, we have to create some sort of object where we can store that file for us to work with it later in our program. Now, this is just a pseudocode, but this is an example of how it will look like. So either you will declare an output file. An output file just indicates that you will be writing something to a file. So you're going to be outputting some data into a file. And then you have to create a name for your variable that's going to hold that file. Or also, this is how you open a file right here. Also, it's pseudocode, so it's not really as strict. Like, the rules are not strict with pseudocode. However, when you come to working with different other programming languages, they will have specific rules for how you have to open the file, how you can work with files, how you can close a file. But in pseudocode, it's simply just open. Then you will specify which file you want to open with the name of that file at the end. Then you can write something to a file. Again, this is pseudocode. You'll probably have some sort of write, and then you will assign whatever you want to write to that file to the variable that holds that file. And then after that, you will just have to close your variable, close that file that you have been working with. Now, delimiters and EOF marker. EOF just stands for end of file. So EOF marker just stands for a some sort of sequence of characters or some word that will let you know that this is the end of the file. There's nothing else in that file anymore. And delimiter is a character or a word that will let you know that this is the end of a piece of data. And a piece of data can be anything. A piece of data can be just one sentence, and the period would be that delimiter, letting you know that this is the end of the sentence. Or it can also be the tab when you go on the next line. So whenever you go on the next slide, enter or return key, that can also be a delimiter, letting you know that this is the first line that you read, and now you're reading the second line. So delimiter lets you know that it is the end of piece of data, and end of file lets you know that this is the end of the file as a whole. Now, how do we read data from a file? It's the same idea as writing data to a file. However, it's a little bit different. You will probably have to specify that you have a different type of file. Remember when we specified output file? In this case, we're specifying input file because we're going to take input from a file. Now we will specify some sort of variable where we're going to hold that file. Then we're going to open, again, the first step, opening your file with specifying which name of that file, which name that file has. Then we're going to read some sort of data. Again, this is just pseudocode. Read, usually it's a different keyword in different languages. However, we're just going to read some sort of item name from our inventory file, and then we're just going to close the file. So all you need to know, the difference between writing to a file and reading from a file, is in this sentence right here. If we want to read something, we will use the read mode and say read something from a file. If we want to write something to a file, we're going to say write whatever we want to write to that file. The only difference between the two. There's also, so we have the read mode and we have the write mode that we saw already. However, there's also the append mode. And append mode is, it works similarly to the write mode. However, if you use your write mode and you want to write something to a file that already exists, that file will be completely deleted. So anything that you want to write to a file that already exists, if you're using the write mode, will be erased, and whatever you're putting into that file will be the only thing that's going to exist in that file. However, with append mode, that does not happen. with the append mode, if the file already exists, it will not be erased. The data that you're putting into that file will just be added to the data that already exists in that file. So this is the only difference between append and write mode. The write mode will completely discard the data in the file that already exists, and append mode will just add your new data to the old data of the file. You can also use loops to process files. However, in some different languages, there are specific loops that are set up to ease your life and while you're working with files. However, this is just a little example of how you can read large amounts of data from a file. So we have a for loop, and the for loop is a count control loop. So we know how many times exactly this loop will run. So we have a for, and we have a counter that starts at 1 that will go until num days. Num days is just a variable. We don't really know what that variable contains. So for now, it's just number of days. And then we're going to display enter the sales for day whatever, day 1, for example, enter the sales for day 1. Then we're going to get the user to type how many sales they did for that day. And then we're going to take that number and write it to a sales file. So as you can see here, this loop will just ask the user repeatedly to up to the number of days that the sales happened. And then we're going to ask the user over again and again and again to input the sales for each of the days. And automatically, we're going to write that number to our sales file. You can also use arrays while you're working with files. And let's recall arrays. Arrays are just basically like a list of items. So for example, if we have a list of numbers from 1 to 4, this is an array of integers 1 through 4. I don't know where it went. Right here. So this is an array, and we can also either take contents from our array and upload it to the file, or we can read the contents of a file into an array. So to read the contents of your file into an array, you will have to open the file. Then you will have to use some sort of loop to take all of the items that exist in that file and put it into an array. Pretty simple. For saving our contents of array to a file, we have to open the file, and then we have to use a loop to go through each element of our array. In this case, is 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we have to store each one of those elements into a file. So again, the logic is not that complicated. So let's see. Processing records. So this is just to show you that these exist in the coding world. So this is called a record, this whole thing right here. Ingrid Virgo 4587 engineering. So this is one record that belongs to this person, Ingrid Virgo. This is a way to store information. You will be getting more familiar with records when you go to your SQL course in about 10, 11 weeks, 12 weeks. However, this is how they store data in a database. So there will be a separate file with all of the records, for example, for all of the employees in a company. This how the information about them will be stored on a separate file. However, you will learn how to work with these types of records and these types of files later in a different course. Let's see. Do you have any questions?